They say a single night can't change your life. But for Sofia Rossi, a single night was all it took to set her world on fire and turn it to ash. She was a chef, a woman who wove dreams from basil and garlic, but whose own dream was unraveling into debt and despair. For one night, she allowed herself a moment of oblivion in the arms of a charming Italian tourist, a man whose promise to come back became a bittersweet echo in the ruins of her life. But the promise held a secret, and the night had a consequence. The man she knew as Rio, a river of easy laughter and kindness, was in truth Don Vittorio Ferro, a fortress of silence and power. Not a businessman, but the head of the Sicilian mafia. A man whose legacy was forged in iron and blood, and for whom lineage is the only law that matters. Their connection wasn't sealed with a goodbye kiss, but with a life growing inside of her, binding her to a world she never knew existed. And he returns not with a request, but with a decree, claiming not the woman he met, but the heir she carries. This is the story of an ordinary woman, forced to become a lioness to protect her child in a world of wolves. It is a tale of how a ruthless king who had everything discovers his only vulnerability, and his greatest strength in the small heart beating inside his unborn heir. So, pour yourself a glass of wine, and prepare for a journey from modern America to ancient, dangerous Sicily. Comment with a crown emoji if you believe duty and desire can wage the most dangerous war of all, and subscribe for more stories of love forged in fire. Get ready for a story that proves the most powerful love isn't found, but claimed. It's a story about an unexpected heir, and the Iron Empire he will either unite or destroy. The autumn rain fell on the city not with passion, but with a tired resignation, kissing the asphalt and blurring the streetlights into impressionistic strokes of gold and crimson. On the street, the neon sign for Piccolo Sogno, Little Dream, flickered with a weary defiance. One of the O's in Sogno had surrendered, blinking on and off, like an eye struggling to stay open. The dream was exhausted. Inside the kitchen, the air told the truer story. Beneath the vibrant, hopeful notes of fresh garlic, basil, and the sweet, simmering tomato sauce that was Sofia's soul in a pot, there was a cold, metallic undercurrent. It was the scent of desperation. Sofia stood with her back to the door, her shoulders a tight line beneath her stained white chef's coat. Her hands, usually so deft and purposeful as they danced over fresh pasta dough, now trembled almost imperceptibly as she sorted a stack of papers on the stainless steel counter. They weren't order tickets. They were bills. Each white sheet was a silent executioner. She felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach, cold and heavy as lead. The overdue rent, a stark, bold number. The wine supplier who now only accepted cash. The electricity bill, a bloody red warning stamped across the top. Just one more month, she told herself. The same quiet lie she had been whispering for the past 6. Her eyes scanned the figures without truly registering them. They were too large, too abstract in their power to destroy. One paper, however, was different. It was folded and creased, a pale, sickly shade of red with an official seal. She picked it up. It felt like the heaviest thing in the world. The tremor in her hands worsened. It was not a bill. It was an eviction notice. The word, eviction, seemed to vibrate on the page, a low hum of failure that resonated deep in her bones. The air fled her lungs, leaving a hollow, freezing void. The sound of the sauce simmering on the stove, once a comforting lullaby, now sounded like a mocking laugh. The kitchen, her sanctuary, her entire world, suddenly felt like it was shrinking, the steel walls closing in like a trap. She squeezed her eyes shut, the sharp edge of the paper digging into her palm. An image flared in her mind, her father's smiling face as he handed her the keys to this very place, the smell of fresh paint mixing with rosemary. "Make this place your heart, figlia mia," he had said. And now, her heart was being foreclosed on. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. Instead, a cold, quiet fury began to climb her spine. She folded the notice with a violent precision, creasing it again and again, until it was a hard, compact weapon in her hand. She would not sink. If she was going down, she would go down fighting. It was with this chilling fire in her veins that she stepped out of the kitchen and into the rainy night, unaware that she was walking directly into a much larger inferno. The food festival was an island of light and noise in the wet darkness. Loud music and the buzz of hundreds of conversations spilled from a grand pavilion, promising warmth and life. To anyone else, it was an invitation. To Sophia, with the eviction notice jammed in her apron pocket like a shard of ice against her skin, it felt like an insult. She was there on obligation, serving miniature portions of her signature lasagna from a cramped stall in the corner, a contractual duty she now bitterly cursed. Her smile for the passing patrons was a well-rehearsed mask, stretched taut over the storm raging inside her. The air inside the pavilion was thick, a chaotic symphony of scents. The sweet perfume of freshly fried cannolis dueled with the briny tang of marinated olives and the earthy, decadent aroma of truffles. Crowds drifted like a slow-moving river, anonymous faces laughing, eating, living lives that suddenly felt a million miles away from her own. She served the last portion, the silver tray now empty and smeared. The smile on her face finally faltered, then collapsed. Leaning back against the counter, she let the full weight of the day, the week, her entire life, wash over her. That's when she heard the voice. "Scusi." It was quiet, yet it possessed a rich, deep texture, like a vintage Barolo. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the festival's cacophony like a sharpened knife. Sophia lifted her head, preparing to force another smile, but the words died on her lips. He stood on the other side of her counter, tall, dressed in a simple elegance that spoke louder than any brand a dark cashmere sweater, perfectly tailored trousers. But it wasn't his clothes that held her motionless. It was his eyes. They were dark, intensely focused, and they were looking at her not as a hungry customer, but as if he were reading the pages of a rare and fascinating book. A ghost of a smile played at the corner of his lips. "It seems I am late to the party," he said, his voice laced with an Italian accent that was both smooth and precise. He gestured to the empty tray. "A tragedy. I was told this was the only stall worth visiting." A flush of warmth crept up Sophia's neck, chasing away the chill. In that instant, under the focused weight of his gaze, she wasn't the failing chef. She wasn't the woman who had just been handed the death sentence for her dream. She was the artist he had come to admire. "The artist seems to have run out of paint," she replied, the words coming out with a wry huskiness she didn't recognize as her own. His smile widened slightly, reaching his eyes. They crinkled at the corners. Then the artist must be thirsty. He glanced around the chaotic pavilion, then met her gaze again, a silent question passing between them. "Allow me to find us somewhere quieter. I believe a masterpiece, even a culinary one, deserves a proper conversation." He didn't wait for an answer. He simply held her gaze, a silent assurance that with him, for a little while at least, she could forget the blinking neon sign and the cold, heavy paper in her pocket. And for the first time that night, Sophia felt a flicker of something she thought had been extinguished forever, a tiny, dangerous spark of hope. She untied her apron. The dream may be exhausted, she thought, but for tonight, she wasn't. The hotel room was a silent sanctuary suspended above the pulsating city. Outside, the rain had softened to a whisper, its tears streaking down the vast plate glass window and transforming the streetlights into rivers of gold and red. Inside, the only light came from a single low-wattage lamp that bathed the space in an intimate amber glow. They had been sitting in opposing armchairs, a glass of red wine in each of their hands. The cacophony of the festival had been replaced by a silence so dense it felt alive. Sophia could hear the quiet splash of wine as he refilled his glass, the gentle tick of a clock she couldn't see, and the sound of her own breathing, which felt entirely too loud. Ryoshi knew him only by this fluid, simple name did not press her with questions. He watched her. The way he held his glass, with a calm, steady grip, was a stark contrast to the almost imperceptible tremor in her own hands. "You build entire worlds on a plate," he said finally, his deep voice filling the space between them. "I tasted your passion tonight, Sophia, and your fight." The air grew thin. No one had ever described her work, her life that way. He saw past the failing business and the tired smile. He saw the warrior. He rose, not with the predatory energy she might have expected from a man so confident, but with the slow, deliberate grace of an anchor settling into its harbor. He stopped before her, reaching out a hand, not to touch her, but to take her glass. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a touch. It was an electric current, a silent, undeniable jolt that shot straight to her core. He placed both glasses on the side table. The soft clink of crystal against wood was the only sound. When he turned back to her, the geography of the room had changed. The space between them was smaller, denser, charged. He knelt before her, bringing his eyes level with hers. He did not invade her space. He made it sacred. He lifted a hand, and Sophia's world slowed to a crawl. His fingers hovered a millimeter from her cheek, pausing in the air like a held breath, a promise. She could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, smell the faint scent of rain on his cashmere sweater, and the earthy aroma of wine on his breath. She closed her eyes. It was all the permission he needed. His touch, when it came, was impossibly gentle. A shocking tenderness from a man who radiated such strength. It undid her. A soft sigh escaped her lips. A sound of surrender. He leaned in, and the kiss was not a collision, but a discovery. It was slow, deep, a conversation without words. It wasn't about taking, it was about finding. It was the easing of a pain she had carried for so long, a yielding to a calm she had never known existed. Her fingers, which had been clenched, uncurled and gripped the fabric of the armchair. His hand moved from her cheek to the nape of her neck, his thumb stroking the frantic pulse he found there, gently soothing it. He stood, lifting her with him as if she weighed nothing. The weight of the world, the eviction notice, the failing restaurant, the broken dream seemed to dissolve in that single fluid motion. The camera of her memory would later pull back, framing their silhouettes against the rain-streaked window. His hand rested securely on the small of her back, a gesture of quiet possession, of protection. He guided her out of the frame, and the image lingered on the 2 wine glasses, standing side by side on the table. Outside, the rain finally stopped, the storm inside and out finding a moment of peace. The first thing Sophia noticed was the light. It was not the tired, gray light that usually filtered through the window of her small apartment above the restaurant. This was a soft, silver light, flooding the room with an ethereal calm. The rain was gone. The world outside was washed clean. She opened her eyes slowly, luxuriating in the feel of the impossibly soft Egyptian cotton sheets against her skin. For a long, blissful moment, she didn't move, just breathed. The knot of anxiety in her stomach, her constant companion for so many months, was gone. In its place was a lightness, a stillness she hadn't felt in years. She turned. The other side of the bed was empty. The pillow still held the faint indentation of his head and the subtle scent of sandalwood in him. A familiar, cold panic began to prickle at the edges of her newfound peace. Of course, it had been too good to be true. A dream. An escape. Then she heard the soft click of the main door. Rio entered the room, holding 2 white porcelain cups. He had changed from the sweater into a simple linen shirt. The sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong, capable wrists. His dark hair was slightly damp, and in the clean light of morning, he looked younger, less enigmatic. He paused when he saw she was awake. A small smile touched his lips, the same one that had disarmed her completely the night before. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble in the quiet room. He walked over and placed one of the cups on her nightstand. The rich, bold aroma of fresh espresso filled the air. "I thought you might need this." Sophia sat up, instinctively pulling the sheet with her to cover herself. She felt exposed, vulnerable under his calm gaze. But there was no hint of predation in his eyes, only a quiet observation. "I don't usually," she began, her voice trailing off, unsure of what she was trying to say. "I know," he interrupted gently, as if he could read the turmoil in her mind. He sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "You know, at the festival last night, you smiled 100 times, but I only saw your real smile for the first time this morning, when you were sleeping." He reached out and with his thumb lightly brushed the corner of her mouth. The gesture was fleeting, feather-light, but it left a trail of warmth on her skin. "I have to leave," he said, and the stillness in the room was suddenly charged with urgency. Family business. It cannot wait. The knot returned to Sophia's stomach, hard and cold. Family business. A wife? Children? The beautiful lie was about to unravel. As if hearing her unspoken fear, he shook his head slightly. It is not what you are thinking. It is complicated. He looked at her then, and the full force of his intensity returned, pinning her in place. But this, he gestured to the space between them, to the room, to the memory of the night. This was not complicated. It was the simplest thing I have felt in a very long time. He stood to leave. He paused at the doorway, turning back to look at her one last time, his dark eyes memorizing her. Sophia, I will come back for you. That is a promise. And then he was gone. He left her in the silent, sunlit hotel room with the taste of espresso on her tongue, and a promise that sounded both like a fairy tale and the most beautiful lie she had ever been told. 6 weeks passed. The fairy tale faded, leaving only the lie. Rio did not return. There were no calls, no messages. He had vanished as completely as he had appeared, a phantom who had drifted into her life and then out again, leaving behind only the ghost of his touch and the lingering scent of sandalwood. The eviction notice became a reality. The Piccolo Sogno closed its doors. The blinking neon sign went dark for good. Sophia packed her life into cardboard boxes, the dream now reduced to a collection of pots, pans, and memories. The lightness she had felt that morning in the hotel room was gone, replaced by a familiar, heavy resignation. The brief, beautiful interlude had only made her return to reality more painful. It was on a Tuesday morning, in the sterile, impersonal bathroom of the friend's apartment where she was temporarily staying, that her world tilted on its axis once more. She stared at the small plastic stick in her trembling hand, at the 2 stark blue lines that appeared with an unforgiving clarity. 2 lines. A positive result. Pregnant. The word didn't feel real. She dropped the test, her hand flying to her stomach. A new life was growing inside of her. Rio's child. The child of a promise. The child of a ghost. The joy that should have been there was choked by a rising tide of pure, unadulterated panic. She was jobless, homeless, and utterly alone. And the father of her child was a man whose last name she didn't even know. Panic was a cold, coiling thing in Sophia's gut. For 3 days, she existed in a fog, moving through the motions of life in her friend's borrowed apartment. She ate without tasting, slept without resting. The 2 blue lines on the pregnancy test had become the epicenter of her world, a stark, silent testament to a single night that had shattered her life's trajectory. The promise, "I will come back for you," now echoed in her mind not as a comfort, but as a cruel mockery. On the 4th day, the fog began to clear, burned away by the first stirrings of the same quiet fury that had propelled her out of her kitchen on the night of the festival. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, the dark circles under her eyes, the pale set of her jaw, and saw not a victim, but the same woman who had refused to cry over an eviction notice. This was not some abstract financial ruin. This was a life, her child, a part of her, and a part of him. She would not let this child come into the world with a ghost for a father. She had to find him. But how do you find a phantom? Rio, a name as fluid and untraceable as water. No last name, no phone number, no digital footprint she could follow. He had paid for everything during their brief time together in cash, a detail that had seemed charmingly old-fashioned at the time, but now felt like a deliberate act of erasure. He had been a ghost by design. She sat at her friend's cluttered kitchen table, a laptop open, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold beside her. She closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that night, pushing past the haze of emotion and wine, searching for a detail, any detail. She replayed their conversations, the easy flow of words in the quiet of the hotel room. He had spoken of his home, but only in vague, poetic terms, of an island where the sun is warmer and the history runs deeper than the sea. Sicily, she had assumed, but that was a clue as vast and unhelpful as an ocean. She let out a frustrated sigh, her fingers drumming against the table. Think. What did they do? They talked. They drank wine. The wine. The memory surfaced, a bubble of clarity rising through the murky waters of the past. In the hotel room, he had ordered a specific bottle. She had commented on its unique, earthy taste. He had smiled. "It is from a small vineyard near my family's estate," he had said. "A difficult grape. It only grows in the volcanic soil of one particular mountain. Stubborn, but worth the effort." She hadn't known the name then, but she remembered the label on the bottle. It was distinctive, elegant, and simple. She had traced the embossed lettering with her finger. Her own fingers flew across the keyboard now. She typed in every combination of words she could think of. Rare Sicilian wine volcanic soil. Exclusive Italian wine Mount Etna. Boutique winery Sicily. The search results were a deluge of tourist sites, wine blogs, and export companies. Page after page, she scrolled through images of wine labels, her eyes growing sore from the screen's glare. None of them were right. Doubt began to creep in again, cold and sharp. Was she chasing a memory that her own desperate mind had embellished? Was he even from Sicily? Or was that just another part of the story he'd spun for a lonely chef? She pushed the laptop away, rubbing her temples. She stood up and walked to the window, staring down at the indifferent city streets. He had felt so real. The connection between them had been the most tangible thing she had experienced in years. Could a man fake such intensity? The way he looked at her, the way he had listened. It couldn't all have been a lie. She went back to the table, her resolve hardening. She would try one more time. This time, she didn't search for the wine. She searched for the feeling. What had he said? Stubborn, but worth the effort. It described the grape, but it also described him. It described her. She focused on the label again in her mind's eye. It wasn't flashy. It was all text. A name. She began typing the most exclusive, high-end wine importers in the city, cross-referencing their online catalogs with Italian varietals. It was a tedious, soul-crushing process. An hour passed, then another. Just as she was about to give up, to finally accept that Rio was a ghost she would never catch, she saw it. On the digital wine list of a Michelin-starred restaurant's private cellar, there it was. The label was unmistakable. Stark white, with elegant, severe black lettering. Vino di Ferro. Ferro's wine, iron wine. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Ferro. It wasn't a place. It was a name. A family name. Her hands trembled as she opened a new search tab. This time she did not type Rio. She typed Ferro Family Sicily. The results were instantaneous and terrifying. The first links weren't to wineries or sun-drenched villas. They were to articles from major news organizations, both Italian and American. The headlines were stark. Ferro clan tightens grip on Sicilian port. The Iron Empire, how the Pharaohs built a dynasty on silence and fear. U.S. Justice Department targets Pharaoh organization in transatlantic probe. The articles spoke of a powerful, shadowy organization, a dynasty that had ruled its corner of Sicily for generations, with a quiet, unyielding authority. They were not just winemakers. According to the articles, they were one of the most powerful and feared mafia families in the world. An empire of iron. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. Her stomach churned, and she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. This couldn't be right. This was a world of violence, of shadows, of cold-blooded power. It had nothing to do with the man who had spoken of stubborn grapes and had touched her cheek with such impossible tenderness. Her eyes scanned a lengthy article from a major news magazine, detailing the family's structure. Her gaze snagged on a name, the current head of the family, a man who had taken over after his father's recent death, a man known for his cold, calculating business sense, and for consolidating the family's power with ruthless efficiency. She clicked on the accompanying photograph. The world stopped. It was him, but it was not him. The man in the photo stood on the steps of a grand, ancient-looking villa. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, not a soft cashmere sweater. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, unreadable calm. His eyes, the same dark, intense eyes that had looked at her with such warmth, were now chillingly remote, surveying the world as if he owned it. This was not Rio, the charming, poetic tourist. This was a king in his fortress. The caption beneath the photo read, Don Vittorio Ferro. The name echoed in the silent apartment. Don Vittorio Ferro. It was a name that felt like a judgment, a final, unyielding wall between the man she had known and the man in the photograph. Sophia stared at the screen, her mind struggling to reconcile the two images. Rio, Vittorio, the gentle lover and the cold Don. The man who had spoken of stubborn grapes was the same man described in articles as a ruthless strategist, the head of a criminal empire. The irony was so bitter it tasted like acid in her throat. The wine he had shared with her, Vino di Ferro, wasn't just a wine. It was a brand, a declaration of ownership. He hadn't shared a secret with her. He had served her his own name in a glass. She pushed away from the laptop as if it were burning, stumbling back until her legs hit the edge of her friend's sofa. She sank into the cushions, wrapping her arms around her stomach, a primal, protective gesture. The life growing inside her was no longer just the child of a phantom lover. It was the heir to an empire of iron and fear, an heir to the name Pharaoh. A wave of nausea, sharp and unrelated to her pregnancy, washed over her. She thought of her own father, a man who ran a simple bakery, his hands always dusted with flour, his loudest outburst a laugh that shook his whole body. She had been raised on the scent of baking bread and the simple ethos of hard work and honesty. The world Vittorio Ferro inhabited was an alien planet, a dark parallel universe governed by rules she couldn't begin to comprehend. Her fear was a living thing, a cold dread that settled deep in her bones. This wasn't a world for a child. It wasn't a world of scraped knees and bedtime stories. It was a world of whispers, of long shadows, of debts paid in blood. Her son or daughter would not be born into that. She would not allow it. For a day, her fear was paralyzing. She read more articles, each one a nail in the coffin of the man she called Rio. She learned of the Pharaoh's power, their reach, their business, that spanned from shipping ports to political influence, all built on a foundation of omerta, the code of silence. Vittorio was not just a participant. He was the architect of its modern iteration. He was described as more dangerous than his forefathers because he was smarter, colder, and hid his violence behind a veneer of legitimate enterprise. Then, slowly, as the shock receded, the fear began to calcify. It hardened from a quivering, shapeless dread into something solid and sharp. It became resolve, the same stubborn resolve Vittorio had admired in the grapes he'd described. He had no idea she possessed it too. She was not some damsel in distress. She was a woman who had tried to build a dream with her own two hands and had fought until the very end. She would fight for her child with that same ferocity. But what was the fight? Running, hiding. The thought was tempting. She could disappear, change her name, raise the baby somewhere quiet where the Pharaoh name was just a whisper from another world. But the articles made one thing terrifyingly clear. The Pharaoh's reach was global. Their power was in information. Sooner or later, he would find out. And what would a man like that do if he discovered he had an heir he never knew about? An heir that had been hidden from him. The thought was more terrifying than any confrontation. He would not just come for the child. He would come for her. No. Hiding was the lamb's strategy, waiting for the lion to find it. She had to do the one thing the lion would never expect. She had to walk into the den herself. She wouldn't go to him for money or for help. She would go to him to state a fact, to draw a line in the sand. To tell him about his child, yes, because he had a right to know, but also to make it clear that the child would have no part in his world. She would offer a compromise, an arrangement, anything that would keep her baby safe and clean, away from the shadow of the Pharaoh name. It was a naive hope, a desperate gamble, but it was the only move she had. The decision settled a strange calm over her. Her objective was clear. The path, however, was a terrifying unknown. How does a chef from a failed restaurant in America request an audience with a man like Don Vittorio Ferro? She couldn't just call him. She couldn't just show up. Her research led her to the legitimate face of the Pharaoh Empire. Pharaoh Imports, a luxury goods company with a sleek corporate office in the heart of the city. It was the public front, the clean, manicured hand that hid the iron fist. It was her only way in. Sophia stood before her full-length mirror, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. She saw the fear in her own eyes, but beneath it, she saw a flicker of something else, something fierce and unyielding. It was the look of a mother, a lioness, preparing to face a lion to protect her cub. She took a deep breath. She booked a one-way flight to Palermo, Sicily, using the last of her savings. Then, She walked into the imposing glass and steel lobby of Faro Imports. She approached the severe-looking receptionist, her heart hammering but her voice steady and clear. "My name is Sophia Rossi," she said, her voice betraying none of the terror she felt. "I need to arrange a meeting with Mr. Faro. It's a personal matter." She knew they would refuse, but she also knew that the mere mention of her name in this building would be like a stone dropped into a quiet, dark pool. The ripples would spread. They would investigate her, and they would report back to their king. She was no longer chasing a ghost. She was summoning a monster, and she prayed she would have the strength to face it when it turned its eyes on her. The flight to Sicily was a journey through a disorienting veil of time. Sophia left the familiar, frantic energy of her American city and landed on an island that seemed to breathe with the weight of centuries. The air that greeted her as she stepped off the plane was different, thicker, scented with the sea, wild herbs, and something ancient, like sun-baked stone. It was the world Rio had described, a place where history ran deeper than the sea. Now, standing on its soil, she felt that depth not as a poetic romance, but as a crushing, intimidating force. She had received no reply to her request at the Faro Imports office. There was no confirmation, no rejection, just a profound, unnerving silence. Yet, she knew she had been heard. She felt it in the unnervingly smooth process at the Palermo airport, the way a black car was waiting just outside the terminal. A man in a dark suit holding a simple sign with her last name, Rossi, printed on it. There was no question of who he was or who had sent him. The ripples had reached the shore. The drive was silent. The man did not speak, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, his hands steady on the wheel. They left the city behind, climbing into the rugged, beautiful hills. Ancient olive groves, their trunks gnarled and twisted like old men, gave way to sprawling vineyards. Sophia saw Mount Etna in the distance, a slumbering giant, a plume of smoke rising lazily from its peak. This was his land, the volcanic soil, the stubborn grapes. Every beautiful detail was now tainted with the chilling reality of what that beauty was built upon. The car turned off the main road, passing through a set of immense wrought-iron gates that opened for them without a sound, as if by magic. The name Faro was subtly worked into the intricate scrollwork. They proceeded up a long, cypress-lined driveway, and then the fortress came into view. It wasn't a villa. It was a citadel, an ancient, honey-colored stone compound that seemed to grow organically from the very rock of the hillside. It was surrounded by high walls, but its position on the crest of the hill was its true defense, offering a commanding panoramic view of the entire valley below. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly impregnable, a gilded cage. The car stopped in a stone courtyard where the air was filled with the scent of jasmine and the gentle sound of a fountain. The driver opened her door, and another man, older, with silver hair and a face carved from granite, met her on the steps. "Miss Rossi," he said, his voice polite but devoid of warmth. "The dawn will see you now." He led her through cavernous, cool rooms filled with dark, heavy furniture, priceless-looking art, and a silence that absorbed sound. Her footsteps on the marble floors seemed sacrilegiously loud. This was a house of ghosts, of power passed down through generations. She could feel the weight of them, of the secrets held within these thick stone walls. Finally, they arrived at a pair of large carved wooden doors. The man opened them and gestured for her to enter. The room was a library, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. A massive, ornate desk stood before a vast window that framed the volcano like a living painting. And behind the desk, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, stood Vittorio Faro. He was not wearing a suit. He was dressed in simple, dark trousers and a white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. He looked less like the corporate titan from the news photo and more like a landed king surveying his domain. As she stepped into the room, he turned from the window, and for a heart-stopping moment, he was Rio. The way the light caught the planes of his face, the quiet intensity in his posture, it was all achingly familiar. But then his eyes met hers, and the illusion shattered. The warmth she remembered was gone, replaced by a cool, analytical stillness. He looked at her not with recognition, but with the detached curiosity of a collector examining a new, unexpected acquisition. "Miss Rossi," he said, His voice was the same deep, resonant timbre she remembered, but it held a different quality now. The warmth was gone, replaced by the cold, hard polish of command. "You have come a long way. I trust your journey was comfortable." The polite, meaningless words were a dismissal of everything that had passed between them. He was setting the terms. They were strangers. Sophia's carefully prepared speech, the lines she had rehearsed over and over, evaporated from her mind. She was left with only the raw, desperate truth. "I didn't know who you were," she said, her voice a little shaky but clear. A flicker of something amusement, annoyance, passed through his eyes. "Most people who seek me out do. It saves time." "I'm not seeking anything from you, Mr. Farrow." "Don Farrow," he corrected her, the words soft but weighted with iron. "In this house, that is my name, and you are here. That, by definition, means you are seeking something." He hadn't moved from behind the desk. He was a general, and this was his command post. The entire room, the entire fortress, was an extension of his will. Sophia felt her resolve wavering under the sheer force of his presence. She took a breath, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. His eyes followed the small movement. His expression did not change, but the stillness in the room deepened, became heavier. He had been waiting for it. "I'm pregnant," she said, the words falling into the silence like stones into a well. "It's yours." Vittorio did not react. There was no shock, no denial, no joy, no anger. He simply watched her, his gaze unwavering, as if he were confirming a piece of intelligence he had already received. The silence stretched, becoming a form of interrogation, a tool to unnerve her. She refused to look away. After a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. "I know." Of course he knew. He had known from the moment her name had been flagged at his New York office. He had investigated her, dissected her life from a distance. The realization that her desperate search for him had been a pointless exercise, that he had been watching her all along, was a cold violation. "The child," he continued, his voice leaving no room for argument, "is a pharaoh. It will be born here, in this house. You will be provided for. You will want for nothing." It was not an offer. It was a decree. The words she had planned to say about compromise, about keeping the child away from his world, died in her throat. They were meaningless here. She had walked into the lion's den not to negotiate, but to be devoured. "No," she managed to say, the word a small, defiant spark in the oppressive atmosphere. "No, my child will not be a part of this." For the first time, he moved. He walked around the massive desk, closing the distance between them. He stopped just a few feet from her, close enough that she could feel the intimidating energy radiating from him. He was bigger than she remembered, his presence filling the room. He was no longer a silhouette, but a terrifying reality. "You misunderstand me, Miss Rossi," he said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling register. "That was not a request. You and the child. You are now a part of this. You came here to tell me I have an heir. You have done your part. Now, you will accept mine." He looked down at her stomach, his gaze possessive, absolute. "That child is my blood, my legacy, and it belongs to me." The cage was gilded as promised. Sophia was given a suite of rooms in a private wing of the fortress. The windows, tall and arched, overlooked a terraced garden where the scent of lemon blossoms and rosemary drifted on the warm air. The furniture was antique and elegant. The linens were softer than anything she had ever touched, and her closet was gradually filled with clothes she had not chosen, in styles she would never wear, all exquisitely made and perfectly tailored. A quiet, older woman named Elena was assigned to her, a constant, silent presence who anticipated her needs before Sophia could voice them, serving her meals, drawing her baths, and tidying away any trace of disorder. She wanted for nothing, and she had nothing. Her passport had been taken for safekeeping. Her phone, after one futile attempt to call her friend in the States, a call that wouldn't connect, vanished from her nightstand, replaced the next day by a new, unfamiliar model that, she discovered, could only make calls within the fortress walls. She was not a guest. She was a precious asset, a vessel for the Pharaoh heir, and she was under constant, silent surveillance. The politeness was the most suffocating part of her imprisonment. No one ever raised their voice. No doors were ever audibly locked. Yet, she knew with a chilling certainty that the moment she tried to walk past the cypress-lined driveway, a polite but immovable man would appear to gently guide her back inside. The first week was a blur of impotent rage. She paced her beautiful rooms like a trapped animal, the silence of the fortress amplifying the furious monologue in her head. She refused meals. She dismissed Elena with curt, angry gestures. She demanded to see Vittorio, only to be told by the stone-faced majordomo, Silvio, that the Dawn is occupied. She saw him only from a distance. Sometimes, through her window, she would see him crossing the courtyard, deep in a low, serious conversation with other men in dark suits. He never looked up. It was as if she were a ghost in his ancestral home, her presence acknowledged but irrelevant to his daily life, which hummed along with the ruthless efficiency of a well-oiled machine. He wasn't ignoring her. He had simply absorbed her into his world, filed her away under resolved, and moved on. This casual erasure of her will was more infuriating than any open conflict. By the second week, her rage had exhausted itself, leaving behind a hollow, aching despair. She began to eat, not out of desire, but out of a dawning, grim realization. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for two. The life inside her needed strength, and she would not starve it out of spite. It was during this period of quiet resignation that the true nature of her new life began to reveal itself. The romance was not dead. It had merely gone underground, existing in the silent, unacknowledged spaces between them. It was a romance told not in words, but in objects and gestures. One evening, a small, leather-bound book appeared on her bedside table. It was a collection of Sicilian folk tales, written in English. There was no note. She knew who had left it. It was an acknowledgement of her isolation, a quiet offering. It was a gesture from the man who had seen the artist in her, not the Don who saw only the mother of his heir. A few days later, after a meal she had only picked at, Elena appeared with a different dish. It was a simple, perfect cacio e pepe, a dish she had mentioned in passing to Rio on their one night together, telling him how its simplicity was its genius. Her heart ached at the memory. He had remembered. Vittorio Ferro, the cold-blooded strategist, had remembered a scrap of conversation from a man he was pretending to be, and had ordered his kitchen to replicate it. He was communicating with her in the only language she had ever truly mastered: food. She began to answer him in kind. Using the small private kitchen attached to her suite, she started to cook for herself. At first, it was just to reclaim a piece of her identity, but then she found herself making a little extra. One afternoon, she made a small rustic apple crostata. When Silvio came to her rooms on some pretext, she offered him a slice. "For the Don," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "He works too hard." She didn't know if he would accept it, or if it would even reach him. But that evening, the plate was returned to her suite by Elena, empty. There was no thank you, no acknowledgement. There didn't need to be. It was a parry and thrust in a silent, intimate duel. Their most potent interactions happened when they were in the same space, pretending the other didn't exist. Once, late at night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the grand library. She hadn't expected to find him there, but he was, sitting in a worn leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into a cold fireplace. He didn't seem to notice her at first. The mask was down. In the dim light, she saw not the Don, but a man who looked profoundly weary, the weight of his empire pressing down on him. She saw the ghost of Rio. He looked up then, his eyes locking with hers across the silent room. The mask slipped back into place. The air crackled with everything they refused to say. Her anger, his possessiveness, the memory of a gentle kiss, the reality of their gilded cage. Her hand went to her stomach, the small swell now just beginning to be visible beneath her clothes. His eyes followed the movement, and his jaw tightened. It was not a gesture of tenderness, but of ownership, a reminder of why she was here, a reminder of his victory. Sophia turned and left without a word, her heart pounding. The war between them was not over. It had simply changed battlefields. It was no longer a fight for her freedom, but a fight for her soul, waged in remembered conversations, shared dishes, and stolen glances across silent, lonely rooms. It was a battle to remind the unbending man of iron that the woman he had caged still had a heart of fire. For weeks, the fortress was a world unto itself, hermetically sealed, its routines governed by the silent, unyielding will of its master. Within its walls, the only conflict was the quiet, simmering one between Sofia and Vittorio. Outside, however, the world had not stopped turning. An empire like the pharaohs was not maintained without enemies, and a king who suddenly acquires a secret heir is a king with a new, exploitable weakness. Sofia knew nothing of this. Her world was the garden, the library, and the ever-present watchful eyes of Vittorio's men. She began to find a fragile rhythm in her captivity. The morning sickness of her first trimester gave way to a surge of second trimester energy. Her body was changing, the gentle curve of her belly a constant, miraculous reminder of the life she was protecting. She swam laps in the cool blue water of the estate's pool, the exercise a small act of rebellion, a way to keep her body strong and her own. She and Vittorio continued their silent dance. He left English newspapers for her. She left him simple, nourishing meals she knew he rarely took the time to eat. They were two planets in a fixed orbit, held in place by the gravitational pull of the child between them, never touching, but always aware of the other's presence. The illusion of peace was shattered on a deceptively beautiful Tuesday afternoon. The sun was warm, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of orange blossoms from the groves below. Sofia was walking along a secluded path at the far end of the gardens, a place she favored for its privacy. Elena was a discreet distance behind her, carrying a tray with water and fruit. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under her feet and the lazy buzz of bees. The first sign that something was wrong was a sudden tension in the air, the kind that precedes a thunderstorm. The birds in the cypress trees fell silent. Elena stopped walking. Sofia turned, a question on her lips, and saw the older woman's face was pale, her eyes wide and fixed on something over Sofia's shoulder. Before Sofia could turn, her world collapsed into a blur of rough fabric and the stale scent of tobacco. A force like a band of steel wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet, while a hand pressed against her mouth, stifling the scream before it was born. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She thrashed, kicking her feet, her nails clawing at the hand over her face. Through her panicked vision, she saw another man appear, saw Elena fall to the ground with a cry that was abruptly cut short. They were not Vittorio's men. They were dressed in the rough clothes of farm laborers, but their eyes were cold, their movements brutally efficient. Wolves in sheep's clothing, they had breached the fortress walls. Sofia's mind raced. The baby. Her hands flew to her stomach, her struggles becoming more frantic, more desperate. The man holding her grunted, a string of harsh, guttural Sicilian curses. He began to drag her backward, away from the house, toward a small hidden gate in the garden wall. Then, a sound cut through the air, not a gunshot, but a single, sharp, commanding shout. Vittorio's voice. What happened next was a blur of controlled, terrifying movement. Two of Vittorio's guards, materializing from the landscape as if from nowhere, moved to intercept the man near Elena. The confrontation was swift and almost silent, a ballet of brutal efficiency. But Sofia was still in the grasp of the first man, who now pressed something cold and sharp against her throat. He continued to drag her toward the gate, using her as a shield. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. And then Vittorio was there. He moved with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. He had come from the direction of the house, and in his hand was an object of cold, dark steel. But the true weapon was the chilling familiarity of lethal intent in his eyes. He was no longer the businessman, the weary Don, or the ghost of Rio. He was a predator, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury, his dark eyes fixed not on Sofia, but on the man who held her. "Let her go," Vittorio said, his voice calm, but with a deadly edge that was more terrifying than any shout. The man holding Sofia laughed, a harsh, nervous sound. The great Don Pharaoh, with a weakness, who would have thought? He emphasized the threat with a slight increase in pressure against Sofia's skin. "Drop the gun," or your heir dies before it ever sees a Sicilian sun." Sophia squeezed her eyes shut, a tear of terror escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. She could feel the man's heart pounding against her back, could smell his fear. Vittorio did not lower his arm. His gaze remained locked on the man, cold and calculating. He was making a decision, weighing variables in a deadly equation. For a terrible frozen moment, Sophia thought he might sacrifice her. She was a vessel, an inconvenience, but the child was his legacy. Then Vittorio's eyes met hers over the man's shoulder. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the Don slipped. She saw not a cold calculation, but a raw, possessive rage. It wasn't about his legacy. It was about her. Someone was touching what belonged to him, and that was a sin for which there was no forgiveness. "You made a mistake," Vittorio said quietly, his voice a low promise of death. "You think she is my weakness. She is not." He took a half step to the side, changing the angle. "You are." There was no further warning. A sudden deafening crack echoed through the garden, a sound so violent it seemed to tear the air itself. Sophia flinched, a scream catching in her throat as the arm around her went slack. The weight against her vanished, and she was falling. But before she hit the ground, another pair of arms caught her. Strong, familiar arms. Vittorio pulled her away from the fallen man, turning her body so she wouldn't have to see, his hand coming up to cup the back of her head, pressing her face into the clean, solid warmth of his chest. His other hand went instantly to her stomach, a possessive, protective gesture that was pure instinct. She was trembling uncontrollably, her body racked with adrenaline and shock. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against her cheek. He held her tightly, shielding her from the aftermath, from the sight of his men now silently and efficiently dealing with the scene. He said nothing. He just held her, his hand splayed protectively over their child, his presence a wall of iron between her and the brutal world that had just tried to claim her. In that moment, the gilded cage had been breached, but for the first time, Sophia understood that its bars were not just meant to keep her in. They were meant to keep the wolves out. And the most dangerous wolf of all was the one holding her now, his scent of power and violence and undeniable, terrifying comfort. The aftermath of the attack was as silent and efficient as the violence itself. Within minutes, the bodies were gone. The gravel on the path was raked smooth, and the scent of jasmine and orange blossoms once again dominated the air. The only evidence that anything had happened was the lingering tremor in Sophia's hands and the hard, unyielding set of Vittorio's jaw. He did not release her immediately. He led her back to the house, one arm still wrapped securely around her, his hand a warm, heavy weight on the small of her back. It was not a gentle, comforting gesture. It was an act of possession, a non-negotiable claim. His men fell into formation around them, a moving wall of dark suits and grim faces. The fortress was on high alert, the invisible perimeter of security now made manifest and suffocating. He did not take her to her suite. He led her to his own private study, a room she had never entered. It was starkly masculine, dominated by a large, clean desk, shelves of what looked like historical ledgers, and detailed maps of Sicily on the walls. It was the nerve center of his empire. He sat her down in a deep leather armchair and poured her a small glass of water with a hand that was perfectly steady. He had already holstered his weapon, the transition from lethal enforcer back to controlled Don seamless and chilling. He stood before her, watching her as she took a shaky sip of water. The analytical coldness was back in his eyes, but it was overlaid with a dark, simmering rage that was not directed at her, but at the world, at his enemies, at his own failure to keep the walls of his fortress impenetrable. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low, rough command. It was not a question of care, but a demand for information. Sophia shook her head, unable to find her voice. She touched her throat where the knife had been. There was a thin, shallow scratch, already beating with blood. Vittorio's eyes darkened. He reached out, his fingers tilting her chin up to inspect the mark. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she had just witnessed. For a moment, his thumb brushed against her skin, a gesture so reminiscent of Rio that her breath caught in her throat. He seemed to realize it at the same time, his hand dropping away as if burned. The mask of the dawn slammed back into place. He turned and spoke in rapid, guttural Sicilian into an intercom on his desk. Minutes later, the silver-haired majordomo, Silvio, entered with a small first aid kit. Vittorio took it himself, dismissing the older man with a nod. He knelt before her, the way he had in the hotel room. But this time was a universe away from that night of gentle discovery. He cleaned the small cut with an antiseptic wipe, his movements precise and impersonal. But he was so close she could feel the heat coming off his body, see the coiled tension in his shoulders. "This will not happen again," he said, his voice a flat, cold promise. It was not meant to be a reassurance. It was a statement of intent, a vow of retribution against those who had dared to touch what was his. The dam of Sophia's composure, held together by shock and adrenaline, finally broke. It was not a flood of tears, but of anger. "This is your fault," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fury that was equal parts fear and resentment. "This happened because of you, because of this world you dragged us into." He finished tending to the cut and stood up, looking down at her, his expression unreadable. "You were not dragged. You walked in yourself." "To protect my child," she shot back, her voice gaining strength. "To keep him away from this, away from guns and knives in the garden." "And where would you have gone?" he countered, his voice dangerously soft. "Some quiet town? Do you think they would not have found you? They found you here, inside walls that have stood for 500 years. Out there you would have been a lamb tethered to a stake, waiting for the slaughter. Here, you are in the heart of the pride. There is no safer place in the world for you." "Safer?" she laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "I just had a knife to my throat. Your world put us in danger." "My world," he said, his voice dropping even lower, each word laced with steel, "is the only thing keeping you alive. My name is the reason you were a target, but it is also the reason you are still breathing." He was right. The terrifying logic of his world was inescapable. His name was both the poison and the antidote. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of two adversaries who have finally laid their weapons on the table and acknowledged the brutal truth of their situation. "Who were they?" she asked, her anger giving way to a weary need to understand. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating the merits of sharing any intelligence with her. "The Rinaldi family," he said finally. "Vultures. They see a new heir as a chance to destabilize, to create a power vacuum." He began to pace the room, the controlled energy of a caged panther radiating from him. "They made a calculation, that I would be weakened by sentiment, that I would hesitate." His eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of the cold fury from the garden. They calculated incorrectly. In that moment, she understood something profound about him. His control, his coldness, was not a lack of emotion. It was a shield for it. The rage he felt at her being threatened was so immense, so volcanic, that he had to encase it in iron to keep it from consuming him and everything around him. He wasn't unfeeling. He was terrifyingly full of feeling, all of it bent toward the singular purpose of power, control, and now, a brutal form of protection. "From now on, you do not go anywhere without me," he stated, his back to her, as he stared out the window at his domain. "Not the garden, not the library, not even the dining room. Where I go, you go. You are no longer just a resident of this house, Sophia. You are the shadow of its master. It is the only way I can guarantee your safety." It was a declaration that changed everything. The gilded cage had just become smaller, its bars now forged from his constant, suffocating presence. It was a prison sentence. But it was also, in the brutal, twisted logic of their world, the first time he had truly acknowledged her not as an asset, but as a partner, however unwilling, in a war she was only just beginning to understand. The truce was not one of peace, but of shared danger. A truce forged in the heat of a single gunshot. Vittorio was true to his word. Sophia's life became inextricably tethered to his. She was a silent, watchful presence in his study as he conducted business in clipped, coded phone calls. She sat across from him in the formal dining room, sharing meals in a tense, crackling silence that was more intimate than any conversation. She walked beside him through the gardens, always flanked by a phalanx of grim-faced guards. Her gilded cage had shrunk to the size of his shadow. The forced proximity was a strange form of torture. It stripped away the last vestiges of the phantom, Rio, replacing him entirely with the cold, calculating, and dangerously protective Don Farrow. Yet, in the quiet, unguarded moments, she saw glimpses of the man beneath the iron. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes late at night, as he reviewed ledgers, the way he would rub the back of his neck when he thought she wasn't looking. She noticed he started keeping a glass of milk on his desk for her, never mentioning it, just ensuring it was there. And she, in turn, would leave a plate with a simple sandwich for him, a silent acknowledgement of his sleepless nights. They were developing a language of care, unspoken and deeply reluctant. The estate became a fortress on high alert. Guards patrolled the perimeter day and night. The sense of being watched was constant, the air thick with a tension that never dissipated. The Rinaldi family, having failed in their brazen attack, had gone to ground, but Vittorio knew it was not a retreat. It was the quiet before a final, desperate assault. The storm broke on a wild, tempestuous night 3 weeks later. A ferocious wind howled down from the mountain, lashing the fortress with sheets of rain that beat against the thick stone walls like angry fists. The power flickered and died, plunging the estate into a disorienting darkness, lit only by the emergency backup system's dim, ghostly glow and the violent flashes of lightning that illuminated the ravaged landscape. It was the perfect cover for an attack. A deep tremor shuddered through the stone floor, coming from the direction of the main gate. The deafening vibration was followed instantly by a distant, angry rattling that was not thunder. Vittorio was in his study with Sofia when it happened. He had been staring out the window, his body coiled with a tense anticipation, as if he had been expecting it. At the sound of the disturbance, he didn't flinch. He simply turned, his face a mask of cold, lethal calm. "Silvio," he barked into the intercom. "Lock it down, the West Wing, now!" He moved to a large, ornate cabinet that Sofia had assumed held antique books. Instead, he unlocked it to reveal a glint of dark, polished steel. He took something heavy and metallic, the sound of it clicking into place echoing ominously in the room. "Stay here," he commanded Sofia, his voice flat. "Do not open this door for anyone but me." "Where are you going?" she asked, her heart pounding with a fear that was not just for herself, but for him. "To end this," he said, his eyes meeting hers. In them, she saw no fear, only a chilling final resolve. He was about to leave when a sharp, intense pain shot through Sofia's lower back, stealing her breath. She gasped, her hand flying to her stomach, which had tightened into a hard, unyielding knot. Vittorio stopped, his hand on the doorknob. "What is it?" I don't know," she breathed, as another wave of pain, stronger this time, washed over her. "It's too early. The baby's not due for another month." His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his iron composure. The timing was a catastrophic coincidence, a cruel twist of fate. His fortress was under siege, and his heir was choosing this exact moment to be born. For a fraction of a second he was torn. She saw the war in his eyes. The Don, whose duty was to lead his men and defend his home, and the father, whose instinct was to protect the mother of his child. The chaotic sounds outside grew louder, closer. His men were being pushed back. He made his choice. "Silvio," he roared into the intercom. "The birthing room. Prepare it. Now. And get Elena." He turned back to Sofia, his decision made. He strode over to her, scooping her into his arms as another contraction seized her. "They will not have this house," he murmured, his voice a low, fierce growl against her hair. "And they will not have my son." The journey through the fortress was a surreal nightmare. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows on the walls as Vittorio carried her, flanked by 2 of his most trusted guards. The muffled chaos of the battle outside became the soundtrack to Sofia's intensifying labor pains. He took her not to her suite, but down a series of corridors to a part of the house she had never seen, a fortified section deep within the oldest part of the building. The birthing room was clearly a contingency plan he had prepared for long ago. It was a simple, clean room, stocked with medical supplies, its windows protected by heavy iron shutters. Elena was there, her face grim, but her hands steady. Vittorio laid Sofia on the bed, his movements surprisingly gentle. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her sweat-dampened forehead. "You are safe here," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Silvio appeared at the door, his posture urgent, his face streaked with grime. "Don, they've breached the East Terrace. We need you." Vittorio looked from Silvio's urgent face to Sophia's, now contorted in pain. He was being torn in two. "Hold them," Vittorio commanded Silvio, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument. He turned back to Sophia, taking her hand in his. His hand was large, calloused, the hand of a man of command, but its grip was firm and steadying. "Breathe, Sophia," he said, his eyes locked on hers, forcing her to focus through the agony. "Just breathe. I am here." And he stayed. As the sounds of the struggle for his home raged outside the reinforced door, Don Vittorio Ferro, the Iron King of Sicily, held the hand of the woman he had taken captive. He coached her through each wave of pain, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her body and the storm outside. He was no longer the Don, no longer Rio. He was simply a man, watching in raw, terrified awe as his child fought its way into a world of chaos. Hours passed. The sounds of conflict slowly subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. And then, a new sound filled the room, a raw, powerful cry, the cry of a newborn. Elena cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft white blanket, placing him in Sophia's exhausted arms. He was small, perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and his father's intense, unblinking eyes. Vittorio stared at his son, his face a mask of profound, unguarded emotion. The iron shield had melted away, revealing the man beneath, humbled and forever changed. He reached out a hand, his finger, forged for command, now stroking the baby's soft cheek with reverence. Silvio knocked and entered, his expression weary but triumphant. "Don Ferro, the estate is secure. The threat has passed." Vittorio didn't look away from his son. "Good," he said quietly. Then he looked at Sophia, his eyes filled with a new, raw vulnerability. He had defended his fortress. He had won the war. But in this small, quiet room, holding her hand as their son was born, he had finally, truly, surrendered. In the aftermath of the storm, a profound quiet settled over the fortress. The rain had stopped, and the rising sun cast a soft, clean light over the Sicilian hills, washing away the shadows of the violent night. The scent of wet earth and jasmine replaced the acrid smell of gunfire. The battle was over. The Rinaldi threat extinguished not with negotiation, but with the brutal finality that had defined the Pharaoh name for generations. But inside the walls of the ancient home, the victory felt distant, insignificant. The true seismic shift had happened not on the battlefield, but in a quiet, fortified room. Sophia spent 2 days in the sanctuary of the birthing suite, her world shrinking to the miraculous, tiny being in her arms. She named him Marco, a simple, strong name, untethered to the dynastic weight of his forefathers. Vittorio was a constant, yet unobtrusive presence. He would enter the room silently, his large frame seeming to fill the space, and simply watch them. He rarely spoke. He didn't need to. The questions, the awe, the raw, unshielded emotion were all there in his eyes. The iron mask of the Don was gone, and she wasn't sure it would ever fit him properly again. He was a man remade. He would reach out and let Marco's tiny fingers wrap around his own, a look of stunned wonder on his face. He saw not a legacy, not an heir, but his son. And when he looked at Sophia, it was with a gaze stripped of possession and power, replaced by a deep, unsettling reverence. He no longer saw the vessel of his heir. He saw the woman who had fought like a lioness, who had faced him down, and who had given him this impossible gift in a room filled with the sounds of war. On the third day, she felt strong enough to return to her own suite. Vittorio carried Marco, his movements still laced with a new, unpracticed tenderness, while Elena helped Sophia. When they entered her rooms, something was different. The ornate, heavy furniture she had always disliked was gone. In its place was a comfortable, simple rocking chair, a beautiful, hand-carved wooden crib, and on the table, a vase filled with wild flowers she recognized from the garden path. It was a room remade for a mother and child, not for a beautiful prisoner. Later that evening, Vittorio came to her rooms alone. Marco was sleeping in his crib, his small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. Sophia was standing by the open window, looking out at the first stars pricking the twilight sky. "The Rinaldi business is finished," Vittorio said, his voice quiet, breaking the comfortable silence. "The threat is gone. You are safe." "We are safe," she corrected him gently, not looking away from the window. He was silent for a long moment. "Yes, we are." He came to stand beside her, not too close, but sharing the same space, the same cool evening air. "Sophia, the world outside these walls is complicated, but what happened in that room, it was simple, the most real thing in my life." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were clear, holding none of the old shadows. "When I was a boy, my father told me my life was not my own. It belonged to this family, to this name. Every choice was made for me. Duty, legacy, honor. I never questioned it. I became what I was supposed to be. Iron, Pharaoh." He paused, his gaze drifting to the sleeping child in the crib. "But when I saw him, when I saw you, I understood. A legacy of iron is a cold, heavy thing. It is a chain, not a foundation. I do not want that for him. I do not want a life of choices made for him." He turned to face her fully, and the vulnerability in his expression stole her breath. "And I do not want that for you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a passport. Her passport. He held it out to her. Beside it, he held out a second one, a newly issued passport for Marco Rossi. And finally, a thick envelope. "This is yours," he said, his voice steady, though she could see the effort it cost him. "The envelope contains more than enough money for you and Marco to go anywhere in the world, to live comfortably for the rest of your lives. I have arranged for a car to be ready. It will take you to Palermo, to a private jet. No one will stop you. No one will follow you. You have my word. The word of Don Pharaoh." Sophia stared at the documents in his hand. It was everything she had wanted, everything she had fought for since the moment she'd learned who he was. Freedom, an escape, a clean slate for her son, away from this world of violence and shadows. The door of the gilded cage was finally, truly, open. She looked from the passports to his face. She saw the man who had knelt before her in a hotel room, the man who had held her hand through the agony of childbirth while his world burned. She saw the ghost of Rio and the soul of Vittorio, finally integrated into one man, standing before her, offering to tear his own heart out to give her what he thought she wanted. She thought of a life in some quiet, anonymous town, a life of peace, of safety, a life without him, and she realized, with a sudden, shocking clarity, that the safety of the cage was no longer what she feared. A life without the complex, dangerous, fiercely protective man before her, that was the true prison. Slowly, she reached out, but her fingers did not take the passports. Instead, she gently pushed his hand down, her hand covering his. "You said it yourself, Vittorio," she said softly, her voice thick with an emotion she could no longer deny. "Your life was not your own. Your choices were made for you." She looked up, meeting his stunned gaze. "What if you made a new choice? What if we did?" She took a small step closer, into his space, into his world, by her own volition for the first time. A legacy isn't just about what is passed down. It's about what you build. Let's not give our son a legacy of iron. Let's give him a legacy of choice, starting with our own. A single tear traced a path down Vittorio's cheek, a crack in the iron she had never thought she would see. He didn't wipe it away. He simply stared at her, a man seeing the sunrise for the very first time. He had offered her freedom, and in return, she was offering him something far more terrifying and beautiful. A shared future, a new dream. Not a piccolo sogno, but a grand one. Big enough for a lion, a lioness, and their son. A legacy not of iron, but of a love that had been forged in fire.